We talk about equity, and equity is not necessarily fair. So we have to find ways to actually meet everyone where they are and give people tools so we can reach this like place of equality. And so equality is giving everybody the same thing. And so some people get that confused. So I'm a vertically challenged person. You all cannot tell because I'm sitting down. And so the image that's really popular is the one where you have people who need to see over the fence to look at a baseball game. And if you give everyone the same stool, but everybody is a different height, that's equal. But equity is giving people what they need. So like I would need a really big stool, but somebody who is 6 feet is probably not going to need a stool at all. And so that's an easy way to remember equity. And then lastly, I think that was it. Yeah, policies, process, programs, and partnerships.
As a woman, specifically as a woman of color, how do you find your footing and voice in the workplace?
So let's talk about that a bit, right? Because we like to say women of color. We like to create acronyms like underrepresented racial ethnic minority or underrepresented racial ethnic group or Black, Indigenous people of color. And the experiences of all of those people are unique. So for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to be speaking from my experience. I identify as a Black woman. So I invite you all to really be open and transparent with your questions about things that are specific to certain communities. And the reason why I'm starting there is because anytime you all have a business problem to solve for, you get really specific, right? Like what problem are we truly solving for? And so there shouldn't really be a difference when you're solving for issues of representation. And I'm sure this comes up in, you guys are a marketing agency, right? When you try and solve for different groups. But as a Black woman, having navigated a lot of different workplaces, I think I continue to evolve in this space, but obviously advocacy is really important. Sponsorship, mentorship is critical, and networking, and not just networking with people. And actually, let me not say networking because I think it's overused and it lacks a lot of depth. Like building meaningful relationships and connections, and not just with people who are more senior, who have more experience, but even at your level. Like I think Issa Rae said this. She's like, sometimes you overlook a peer thinking that they can't help, but everybody has like a different knowledge base. And so I think it is identifying people that are successful, and you don't have to necessarily be able to reach them and have a conversation, but you absorb kind of how they show up, you observe, you take notes. And I think also really being focused on like, what's your personal brand? Like, regardless of how you identify, like, what do people say about you when you're not in the room? Like, are you a person who's known for getting things done right the first time? And I don't know how many people leaders are on this call, but I think for me, it's like, okay, what's important to this people leader, whether it's my direct leader or a leader across the company, and how can I make their life easier? Like, what problem are they trying to solve for? Now, you guys might be like, okay, it's Black History Month. Keep it all the way real, because I know you probably had to work a little bit harder. And that is the truth, right? And so I think part of it is really understanding like what people are really saying, right? It's not that there's not enough room for people to be promoted. It's like, what's the underlying reason why my advancement might be a little bit longer than someone else's? And then really looking at the structure and saying, okay, so there may be an absence of education. So how do I bring awareness to that? And so right, wrong, and different. My mother raised me to be really honest and outspoken. And so I think it's actually benefited me later in my career when I've learned how to really be open and be honest and ask the difficult questions and expect answers that made sense, that benefited not just myself, but other people who also might be challenged in the same way. Let's see. You said ideas, raises, and promotions. I'm looking at the questions to make sure I touch on that. First of all, raises are critical. And I think knowledge around like the pay gap and pay equity, especially as we approach Women's Equal Pay Day in March, which is March 15th this year. But it's important to know that Women's Equal Pay Day, that's just the beginning. And that's actually for white women. So pay day actually runs from March all the way to December, when Latin women are actually finally paid fairly at the same rate as white women and white men. And embedded in that, there's a pay date for working mothers, if we have any parents and caregivers on the call, and then also the LGBTQ plus community. So negotiate everything even if you end up with a no, that's the worst that can happen, right? And I think viewing any type of conversation around raises and promotion as a two-sided conversation, right? And so, it's okay. It doesn't have to be you asking for more than what you might be. Let me see, how can I say this? It doesn't have to be a tense conversation, right? It doesn't have to be an uncomfortable conversation. You're learning what someone has the capacity to provide, and then you all are kind of level setting and just having open dialogue. And so at least like expectations are set when you do that.
One thing you said, Misty, was that in order to advocate for yourself, or some tools you can use would be like sponsorship and mentorship. But what do you mean by sponsorship, just so I understand?
So sponsorship is, you may not know that you have a sponsor, right? And I think to me that correlates to kind of like you building relationships, meaningful relationships, and letting people know about the work that you're doing. I think when you're early in career, and I ask for some company stats to just understand like time and role, kind of what generation is on the call today, you actually might be timid about talking about what you do really well, what you're passionate about. And so the way that you can develop sponsorship is when people know who you are and what you do and what you desire to do. And then you have people who are saying your name in rooms that you are not in, who can reference like critical projects, critical bodies of work that you've contributed to in ways that you wouldn't be able to do for yourself, or maybe even your mentor wouldn't be able to. Sponsors also have a level of influence that you may not know that they have. And so you literally just don't know. All you can do is just kind of show up authentically, do your best work. And even when you're not having the best day, like, let's just be all the way real. Like, you are not always motivated at the same level you are every day, whether it's external factors, internal factors, somebody pisses you off at work, but you have to work as if you actually are working for your own personal brand, not that you're working for other people, if that makes sense. Like, so I think that's how you kind of get sponsorship.
How can one be an ally and show up for others, specifically the underrepresented groups and peers in the workplace?
So I like this question because I think I like to answer it differently. And I think there are layers to how you show up for being an ally. So one, let's be really clear that to be an ally, that's a verb. It's not a noun. So that means that there has to be action, like you have to be doing something. And not just what you think people want, but you have to really be guided by the affected community to ensure that the actions that you're taking are contributing to the outcomes that really need to occur. And so when I think about how to show up for other communities, it's like, first, how are you showing up for yourself and for your own community, right? And so the hardest thing to do in being an ally is, I liken it to the Michael Jackson Man in the Mirror song. Like, I'm starting with the man in the mirror and I'm asking him to change his ways, because in order for you to really be an effective ally, you really have to first look deep within to understand how you contributed to the experiences of other people. Even if you are generations removed from some of the things that have happened, it is Black History Month. So if you can trace your lineage and you know that maybe you have family members who were slave owners, you can't erase that, but you have to reconcile that that isn't a part of your history in order for you to move past it and really be an effective ally. And so it is listening. I think it is a lot of listening, and it's a lot of education, but educating yourself. And so I'm really fortunate to do this work with a CEO that is just phenomenal. And go follow his IG, Chris_Himes. But two things that he does, he's intentional about deepening his understanding around like structures of systemic oppression for all people. And the one that's really difficult is the anti-Black racism, which is actually at the crux of a lot of the other isms and phobias that we experience. And when you look at the intersectionality of all of our identities, like, none of us are binary at the end of the day. And we have our lived experiences that contribute to how we see the world. So something simple you all can do from an ally perspective. If you are on IG, which I think this crowd might be on TikTok, you can follow people who are different from you, whether it's race, gender, generation, parents, caregivers. Like, follow them and consume and absorb the content the same way you do everything else about the culture that you love. right? So like if you love hip hop, if you love R&B, and you're like, bet I'm watching the Grammys just so I can see the 50th anniversary of hip hop celebrated, or the God Did performance at the end, or Lizzo, or whomever. Like, follow people in the space who are also educating, like Lovey Ajayi Jones. Glennon Doyle would be an example of a really good ally. Myleik Teal puts out really good content. Yava Blay. And then also there's centers for like Boston Center of Anti-Racist Research. I'm sure you all may have heard of Ibram X. Kendi. Really, really good content. Or there's an organization called Lesbians Who Tech. Gender Cool is an organization. So there's all these organizations where you can just consume and absorb content. As a company, a resource that we use is Catalyst, and catalyst.org. They have a plethora of topics, and I don't know what our contribution is to them annually, but everybody at our company, and we're a company of 15,000, gets a free membership. So we use our Indeed login, and you can go in and search any topic. But allyship, in summary, definitely a verb, definitely requires you to actually have some time alone to self-reflect and to really do the hard work so you can actually understand another perspective that's different from your own.
I just wanted to see your take on some current events that have been going on just in terms of injustices and targeted policy towards minorities.
I'll be honest, I tune in because I have to, but it's quite exhausting to actually, turn on the TV or whatever news outlet, and every single day there is something. And, even if we zoom out and look at it globally, even in this month of Black history, I think this Soapbox series is so important because we can look at what's happening just across the world and just see, I say, the world is currently like a dumpster fire on a NASCAR racetrack. Every single day, there's always something. And so, if we're going to talk current events, my 1 to 2 line summary of what it feels like, or what my thoughts are on, the police killings of Black men, Black women. It's systemic, it's structural. And I think there are ways that we can actually change it. And there are choices that we're making to just not change it. And some of that stuff is just beyond our control. The comparison is, I think it was New Zealand. I think the Prime Minister of New Zealand was a woman. I think they have really strict gun laws in place, polar opposite of how we experience the world here. But the data doesn't lie, right? And you see it in the results, which is why the number one thing about my strategy is policy and process, because that's what we all go back to. Some people don't recognize their bias. A lot of it is unconscious, and people are just not being interrupted enough, and they don't surround themselves enough with diverse perspectives to really understand the impacts of their actions, right? Not the intent, but the actual impact. And so for anyone on the call who's like, well, but I really didn't intend to cause harm. If I'm driving down the street and I hit an animal, I didn't intend to hit the animal, but the animal is now injured. So the impact of that is still significant. And so I like to share these things to just make them more realistic. Some of the notes from the speaker doc, it talked about disparity in Golden Globes, movie nominations, media. Again, I think it's all systemic. It is all structural. And until we actually build policies. And so there is an organization now that actually sits, I think, adjacent to the Grammys. Despite what happened with Beyonce, I'm a huge B fan, and I do have tickets to the upcoming tour. Yay me. Hope all of you all got your tickets if you choose to go see her. But again, I think it requires some organization, right, for us to have an impact. And we cannot let our foot off the gas, even if we're tired. We have to stay motivated. We have to find our purpose, find our why. And, I'm not a mother per se, but if I always want to try and broaden the conversation, think about what you can be doing for future generations by doing just one thing differently to make things better for everyone. And the last thing I'll say about this is a lot of times people are so concerned with the attention that certain groups are getting. In particular, when it comes to the Black community, it's well, why do we need to do reparations? If you are familiar with the whole conversation around Manhattan Beach and that family, why do we need to have these conversations? It's really, really important because When you solve for the margins, you actually improve outcomes for every single person. So when you look at things for, let's say, people with disabilities, let's say the ramps that are required for commercial buildings for accessibility, the intention around building those was to make it easier for people who are wheelchair bound to get into buildings. But what about the mother with the stroller? What about the person who has a leg injury? And so that's an example of, something that was built with one particular population in mind, but actually makes it better for everyone. So again, it's like, how do we actually affect change at the policy level? How do we build processes in our companies to actually create better experiences for everyone?
So the last topic I wanted to touch on before we open it up to the greater body is, what can we do next in terms of community, workplace, and even at home for best resources, and how can we show up?
So right now, there's a lot of conversation about the work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space intersecting with mental health and well-being. And so I think we need to start there and just address, like, the past 2 years have been difficult for everyone due to a ton of different reasons, right? And I love my boss because she's like, this is not the oppression Olympics, because some people may say, well, it's been harder for Black people because of Black Lives Matter. It's been harder for the Asian American Pacific Islander community because of increased hate or anti-Semitism for Jewish people, or, difficult for parents and caregivers. It's just been hard. And it's been hard really, really differently. So I'm level setting there by, like, the first thing you can do is make sure you are caring for yourself in a way that goes beyond what we see on social media, beyond lighting the candles, taking a bath, but truly disconnecting and unplugging from all of the information that we consume every single day. If you have something that you're particularly passionate about, whether it is with older people or children or the unhoused population or food insecurity, find a cause that you care about and then start to show up to that cause. I think it needs to be something that hits home for you. So if you've ever had a relative that has had, let's say, cancer or another chronic illness that often results in death, find something that you will be inspired by. And that's how you show up in the community. Because if you are begrudgingly doing this because everybody else is saying it's the right thing to do, it's not going to be sustainable. And I think there's joy in those little moments. You said in community, in the workplace. In the workplace, I say have open conversations. You don't have to agree with the perspectives of everyone. Like, that's just not realistic. But I think everyone should be respected, right? Like, you don't have to change your ideals and your beliefs and your morals, but you can develop a tolerance to where you can hear and listen to a perspective that's different from yours that can provoke thought. And so I keep getting this pop-up, like, Pierre Laveau has left the meeting. I'm going to text him on the side. And so I think that's another thing that you can do. So another thing from a company standpoint that we've just put as a part of our crisis response strategy, we developed what we call Leading Through Difficult Times guides. And so we started with the AAPI hate. Then we did it for Black Lives Matter. And, like, anytime we have something, now we have a framework. And so what it is, it's like, read this, watch this, listen to this. So if you like to read blogs, if you like to read white papers, it's literally a medium for everybody to consume content in a way that is digestible for them, but it happens every single time. So the Russia-Ukraine, we had something ready. Anytime we have it. And then we have what we call, they went from healing hours to brave spaces to compassion circles. And we do them on a regular basis. We have like 10 inclusion resource groups at our company, and we bring in outside facilitation so we can have guided discussions and people can just process. So I'll be honest, like, I am super guilty. Like, when I was an earlier leader, I would be like, listen, doesn't matter what's happening outside of work. Once you get here, I need you focused. We have these KPIs, we have these targets, and that's all that matters. And that's unrealistic. And so now there's like scientific evidence that when people are distracted, they're not at their peak performance. If people feel excluded, it actually shuts off a part of their brain, and it's the part of their brain that makes money. And so when there is like trauma, people are not able to focus. So creating those spaces is also really important. And I think disaggregating the experiences, right? So looking across generation, for the purposes of reporting, if you all are there, I would say, lump together your minority population so you don't actually disclose personal identifiable information, but in conversation, like, talk plainly. And for the people on the call, and I think that's the majority of people who are white presenting, you're included in this conversation as well. And I want to really talk about that because we spend so much time talking about race and ethnicity that sometimes you're like, well, am I included? Like, you have a lived experience, you have affinity for cultures depending on where you live. There is culture in terms of being outside the US, whether you're, I don't know, German, Swedish, French. And we need to understand a lot of the nuance in the experience and not dismiss that as well. And then at home, so Netflix has some really good specials. Hulu also has a good special. And so, like, I have a team of business partners, and some of them actually look at shows that they really like, and they will recommend them to colleagues, or it's a part of our like education and training. So on Amazon, we actually have a program called Rising Voices. We partner with Lena Waithe and Hillman Grad, and so we've produced 20 short films over the past 2 years. We're going into season 3. And so you all can use those as content because they're created by Black, Indigenous people of color, and they are stories from their personal upbringing and things that are important to them that will give you different perspectives around all different types of people. Netflix, Chelsea Handler, Hello Privilege, It's Me, Chelsea. I've watched that. I recommended it to a previous audience. People love Brene Brown. I'm kind of on the fence about her, but I won't completely not recommend it. And then Hulu, Hannah Nicole Jones, the 1619 Project. And so it might seem heavy in title, but the narrative and the stories that are kind of woven into it are really powerful. And so you might be like, oh, that's heavy, but it actually is done in such a way where you can actually absorb it and you can see how it's applicable like every day in real life. Please don't be shy. You can ask really tough questions. I don't know if there's a DM feature on here if you want to. Pierre.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Hey, Misty, good to see you.
Hey.
Thanks for giving us your time. We're getting ready to have another presenter pretty soon talk about imposter syndrome, right? And we have an internal speaker talking about it. We have a professional coming in potentially as well. But we'd love to hear your thoughts, how you see it, given that it definitely impacts everybody of all walks of life, but also, probably impacts people of color in a very different way. So if you want to just kind of give your opinion on imposter syndrome to tee up other conversations moving forward, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So I took a deep sigh because I think imposter syndrome is one of those terms that's kind of relatively new. And I think it's quite frankly overused. Like, I think that particularly for women, for Black women, for Latin women, for Asian women, and any other underrepresented, gender minority, it's okay to be uncomfortable about like some things that are new, right? Like, you're supposed to have a certain level of like angst and anxiety. Imposter syndrome is like fear of being found out. It comes up when you're doing something you haven't done for the first time. And so I think we have like over-indexed on the negative parts of it. And I don't think we talk about kind of the creativity, the innovation that kind of comes from doing things that you've never done before. So I would appreciate a more, honestly, like a balanced conversation around imposter syndrome. And also recognizing, I'm just going to say it, right? A lot of times when we have imposter syndrome, it's because we don't see people who look like us, or we see a lot of mediocrity and groupthink that makes us think that our original idea or something that's really, really different is inferior to what the majority of people are already doing. And so I think being able to have a good, network of people to bounce ideas off of, DMs, group chat is helpful, but I think we have to stop playing so much into the terminology because it doesn't have to be a negative connotation. That's my personal sentiment. And I also think it just comes with like some lived experience. So if you're earlier in your career, I would say talk to people who have experienced it before, because you don't have to go through that same circular kind of experience. You can say, okay, it's not me, it's them. And actually my idea is pretty dope and I'm going to push through anyway. And you have to think about like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And so I think sometimes generationally, when we have new ideas, we're not ready to accept the consequences of like pitching a new idea. And I think at your job, imposter syndrome can also be fueled by not having psychological safety. And so if there's a fear of being, whatever, shunned, put out of a team project or something, I think whoever is responsible can create a safe space for people to thrive in that environment.
Britt, I see you have your hand off. So go for it, Britt.
Okay, my question is, working at a larger organization like Indeed, what have been some of the learnings and challenges you've faced in rolling out processes and policies around this topic, I guess, just being at a bigger company as we continue to scale?
Challenges, I think the time that it takes to implement things would probably be one of the challenges. Identifying where some of the work is already started and making sure you have the people from the right teams involved. Like, we are definitely a matrixed organization. And then, we're moving into a space now where everybody is using like this rapid framework or RACI model. And so I think that's really been the challenge. I have not really faced barriers in terms of getting things accomplished because people understand the outcome. So it's like you have to do your research and you have to have a narrative, objectives. You have to understand what the measures of success would be, and then also understanding how to prioritize it for various parts of the business. So I'm not over here just pushing this diversity agenda, not recognizing what's important to my chief revenue officer or what's important to the CFO. And so really and truly, it's how do you build equitable policies and processes that are also embedded in the infrastructure. So it's not adjacent to like the core work, but it's really deeply embedded. And so really and truly, it's like, okay, so who's on board? Who needs to be involved? What's the timeline? And how do I prioritize this?
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Who's up? Who's got a question?
I
had one. Since I read everything, what are some of your favorite books on the topic?
On which topic? We've talked about a lot, like diversity in general.
Yeah, just any of your favorite books you've read.
I'm turning around because I have books.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm going to write them down.
So The Source of Self-Regard by Toni Morrison. I'm reading that right now. And actually, I'm going to share a book list with you all as well. I'm currently reading You've Been Chosen by St. Marshall. The Prophets, I forget the author's name, but The Prophets is a really good book. I actually, if I'm being completely honest, I don't absorb a lot of like diversity content like through book format. I'm more of like podcast, white paper, but I'll give you books that'll just give you a different perspective. If you give me a second, I will pull up a list for you.
Perfect. And podcasts. Big fan of podcasts too.
I think what I can do is actually share a document out with Bryn after this call that has, I had my team create like pick my brain documents, because please don't ask people to do that. That is offensive. And 9 times out of 10, when you're asking people for information, it's stuff that they get paid to do. And so we created them in response to all of the inquiries. And so I can just send those out because it'll have podcasts, movies, sitcoms, and books on there for you.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see.
We got a question from Zaid. You got it.
Awesome. Hi, this was awesome. First things first. Second, love your earrings. And that would be one of my questions to know where you got them from, if you're willing to share. The whole time I need those.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. You can find them at Nordstrom. They were a gift, but they are Givenchy earrings.
Love that. But for the real question, earlier you were talking about showing up for yourself, and I would love to just hear about ways that you do that for yourself, because I know it looks different for everybody. And I feel like sometimes it can be kind of hard to like balance that and figure out what that looks like for you, because it might feel like unoriginal or like difficult. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important. And I'll be really honest, right? Like burnout is now like a designation of like a health issue by the World Health Organization. And, last year I hit burnout probably the middle of the year. Probably did over 100,000 miles in travel. I was never at home. I was always on the East Coast or in Austin. And part of the reason why I'm prefacing it that way is because when you're not well, it hits your team first and people who you interact with the most first. And so one way I do that is like regulating and having people as like my trusted advisors. So I have my crew, my girls outside of work, and I have my work crew. And so they can help me see things that I might not be able to see and how I'm showing up. And so one, I think the awareness piece and the accountability piece. We fortunately have open PTO. And so I absolutely leverage open PTO, and I've made a commitment to take time off, monthly or at least every quarter, because not only is the world hard, but there's a tax that comes with doing this work. And there's like double tax when doing this work as a Black woman in America. I also spend a lot of time brunch, hike, shopping. I have godchildren, so I get some energy and just joy from being around kids. I'm actually really into architectural design, so I love, visiting new places and just kind of taking in the city. Museums have been a new source of kind of like, just disconnecting and decompressing. What else? All the typical things, right? But sometimes I sit in my place and I'm at home, right? And so sometimes it's like silence. Sometimes it's looking like not having the TV on, but just having music on. I enjoy cooking. And so sometimes I just have to really be selfish with my time. And then in a work setting, I think to try and mitigate before you get to burnout is really protecting your calendar. Like, I don't know what your culture is, but if it's heavy, like, meeting heavy, and now everybody wants to be on Zoom or Google Meet, like, you don't need to see me. Like, it drains a lot of energy, right? When you have to constantly look at someone or look at yourself. So I'm really getting clear about what the priorities are. And there's a thread, and I'm laughing because it's how do you redirect when people come to you for things that is really in their remit, but they're looking for you to contribute a significant amount. And all of those things combined are really kind of what I do to really kind of regulate burnout and everything else.
Cool. That was great. All right. I think this will be our last question, Bree, and then we'll close out of here.
Misty, I was just wondering, this is kind of a broad question, but maybe we can kind of tailor it or pinpoint it in a certain direction. But what are some ways that you have been successful in measuring the success of a new initiative?
So obviously it depends on the initiative. And so like my team is actually responsible for one of our company objectives, which is around representation. And so I'll give you an example of something that's measurable. And so I want to, preface this also by saying some measures of success will be quantifiable when you look at demographic composition. Others will be more qualitative and more sentiment based. And so when we look at the promotion rate for women in comparison to men across the organization as a whole, or within certain pockets of our org where we see lower representation, i.e. engineering, non-corporate functions. So year over year growth, speed to promotion, those are critical measures that we look at on a quarterly basis. We obviously look at attrition and retention as metrics of success. And then not just employee engagement surveys, because those are reactive and a lot of times you miss a lot, but we've just implemented what we call upward feedback. So our first line people managers are like not thrilled, but it actually gives us a realistic view of like how people are feeling and what is the interaction between an IC and like a newer manager, right? Because a lot of times you have an IC that's doing a really good job and then they're promoted, but I'm like, what makes you a good IC doesn't make you a good manager. So how do we actually, prepare people for that? So those types of sentiment analysis, we have what we call stay interviews that we do. And so that's how we kind of measure ourselves. I'm trying to think of anything else that I have not mentioned. We also, I think another thing that we do, we have what we call candidate experience panels. So when people are interested in working at our company, we invite them to really hear from some of our most senior leaders, people who are doing the roles that they're interviewing for. And so we have net promoter scores. And so NPS is something that we use to evaluate like how are people experiencing the company? What are people saying about Indeed? I mean, we're on Glassdoor, we're on Fishbowl, and so we just use a bunch of different metrics related to diversity.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Misty. I know we're a little bit over time, everybody, but I think I feel like I could be here forever, just asking questions and learning, and appreciate Misty, you dropping all the knowledge. But before we break, everybody just shout out to really the host, Kayla Hamilton. Nice job, Kayla. Incredible. And Misty, thanks so much for, again, dropping all that knowledge on us.